Welcome to the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology podcast. I'm Gideon Barr, the Executive Director of the ECT, and I'm joined today by Dr. Timothy Kearns, who teaches at the Legionaries of Christ College of Humanities in Cheshire, Connecticut. And Dr. Kearns has turned in for us an article on logic, both general and historical. So, Timothy, thank you for joining me here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I really am very pleased with your article. I think it's very rich, and I was recalling as I read it how much I would have enjoyed something like this early on in my studies. Just to sort of as an entrance into philosophy more generally, but into logic in particular. And so I think it'll be a great service to seminarians and students everywhere.
Oh, great. Well, that's good to hear. Thank you.
So we like to start these conversations by just getting to know you, getting to know the people who contribute to the encyclopedia. So tell us a little bit about your life. Where did you grow up? Did you grow up Catholic? What was your experience of the faith, or first exposure to the Catholic faith?
Yeah, good question. So my parents moved around a lot. I was born in the late 70s, and one thing that is noteworthy about me is I have albinism, so that's why my skin is white and my hair is white and all that. So I'm often mistaken for, someone who's older, but yet sort of people are saying like, oh, that guy's really lively for being so old. But anyway, so that kind of marked a little bit my early upbringing, just in that I was a bit more reserved and things like that. But so I grew up in a number of different places until about 1987 when we settled down in Texas. And that's really where I'm from in some sense. Most of my formative years were there. And my parents were like independent fundamental Baptists. And so we looked down on the Southern Baptist Convention. That's how, like, how theologically conservative we were. Mm-hmm. I later read something about the origins of our movement as kind of a rejection of modern biblical criticism. Basically, there were some pastors in the early 1920s, who began to see that like this Hegelian-informed, spirit-based, historical critical stuff was really undermining a lot, and so what I heard anyway, just kind of down the chain, is that's what led them to kind of say, no, we're going to reject all of it and just focus on the fundamental literal sense. Anything that is just as literal, whatever they mean by that, as possible, that's what we're going to go with. And we were very evangelistic, and so I remember when I was 10 or 12, handing out tracts to people and arguing about religion and whatnot. It was a very devout, I would say. It was a great church, in many respects, that we were part of. No, we were part of a number of them, some various experiences, as I think with many Protestants, you kind of, you don't stick to one. Yeah. Also, my parents moved a good bit, but very, very focused on family, and the church community really supported people very well. I mean, they took care of you, and you would know that everybody looked for you when you came to church, and they were happy to see you, and they would give you things if it was just very, very caring, like a family almost. And so that was a beautiful testament to me of the love that, Christians should have for each other. During those years, I really didn't hear about the Catholic Church, at all, kind of basically until I was like 18. I knew, we were taught that the church is the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation. So I knew that, or so I thought. But that was really the end of it. Like they would just say, well, of course, the whore of Babylon here refers to the Roman Catholic Church, and that was the end of it. And I just thought, oh, okay, sounds good. Didn't really do much more than that. And then I think I'd seen some movies like The Godfather or something where there's some Catholic stuff happening. It always looked good to me, and I never really knew, like, why do we reject that? Like, what's wrong with, singing in those ways and having beautiful candles and stuff? But nobody ever knew. So that was just my experience of it. Wasn't necessarily negative. I didn't have a lot of feelings one way or the other. I just was told that this is not good. So I was a good little boy. So I was like, oh, okay, sounds good. In fact, my brothers this is sort of a random aside, my brothers once got me to do something that was actually wrong by telling me that if I didn't do it, I wouldn't be a Jesus boy. And I was like, oh, I gotta be a Jesus boy though. Anyway, so that was, those were the kind of like the dispositions, I think, that being in that community and really looking up to those people, you know, and I love the Bible and whatnot. Those are the kinds of dispositions that they prepared in me, which I think are good, fundamentally good dispositions. And so we settled, just kind of a little historically, we settled in Texas in like the late 80s. My dad got involved in various things, and he was in and out of different jobs and whatnot. And I moved through high school and ended up doing college, but kind of like at the last minute, went to UT Austin. I didn't even know I could go, but in fact, this fellow who I worked with at a telemarketing company, I was one of those annoying telemarketers in the 90s who would call people.
Call it at dinner time.
That's right, to sell you Citibank, AT&T long distance services, whatever. So I was one of those guys. But our family didn't have a lot of money, so I went to high school till 3:30, then got out of there and worked from 4:30 to 10:30 every day selling long distance services. But when I was there, actually in April or March or April of my senior year of high school, I met this guy who comes up to me and says, "Hey, I see you have albinism. Who's your counselor at the commission?" I'm like, "What are you talking about? Commission? I don't know." He said, "No, the Texas Commission for the Blind. Who's your?" I said, "I don't have no idea what you're talking about, man." And he said, "No, but there's this great commission. Texas is very generous to the blind." And so basically, I didn't know this, but he explained to me that they would pay for my tuition, they would pay for all my books, give me a computer, give me whatever visual aids I wanted, and pay for all my room and board to go to any state school I wanted in Texas.
Wow.
So I learned that in March of my senior year. And so I quickly connected in, and everything was exactly as that kid had told me. I never saw him again, actually. Even though we had continued to work there for another 6 months. So that I went to college because that was an offer, and I didn't really know why. I mean, I didn't have some grand idea. I just was supposed to do it. And that's kind of what brought me into my first real contact with Catholicism in college.
Was there like a university parish or?
Yeah, so there was a fairly active university center at University of Texas at Austin where I went to. And then right across the street, there was also a very active parish. And the center was rather more, a little bit more interested in social justice and outreach and things like that. And the parish was a little more interested in the liturgy and doctrine and things like that. So I ended up going to the center first just because it was more kind of like kids my age, But then that didn't really seem to be what I was primarily interested in studying and whatnot. They were sort of more, maybe for cradle Catholics or some, it's hard to say, but I ended up doing through the St. Austin's Catholic Church, which is right across the street from UT, or was anyway. And but I was introduced to Catholicism actually by an atheist friend that I met like my first 3 days in college. I really didn't know anything about college. Nobody in my family had really ever been. I think one of my brothers went for a little while or something, but I didn't know what you were supposed to do. Like I didn't even know that you're supposed to register for courses. And when they gave me this huge book of the courses, all the courses at UT, I was like, well, okay. So I just like flipped through and found stuff. I mean, there were 50,000 students at UT at that time, so I was really falling through the cracks. But that just gives you a sense for how I didn't know what to do, And so I was hanging out at this dorm a couple days before classes started, and I didn't really know anybody. And it seemed like a lot of people knew each other and whatnot. But there was this other fellow, this Indian guy who I just became friends with. I could tell nobody kind of liked him. He's really smart, but he's also sort of mean to people. And from the beginning, so I decided to be his friend, and he and I just got to talking, and we would argue about everything under the sun practically. But then, he was asking me once, like, well, what's your religious belief or something? Because he told me he was an atheist, and I just said, well, I'm a Protestant evangelical, I guess. I had kind of shifted away some from the fundamentalism of my youth. I mean, it just seemed to me that just didn't seem very plausible. I had some other friends who kind of left and were asking questions that the pastors couldn't really answer, So it just kind of went that way, I think. But by this point, I was still committed, though. I believed, definitely, but I wasn't particularly faithful in some sense. I didn't go to church that much. anyway, so this friend, asked me what I believed, and so I told him, and he was like, "Well, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in God, but the only consistent form of Christianity is Catholicism." I was like, "What? What are you talking about, man? That's just ridiculous. You mean And I said something about the Godfather or whatever, and he looked at me, with his typical, because he was kind of arrogant, and he was like, "You have no idea what you're talking about, do you?" And I just frankly had to admit that was true. I really didn't know anything about Catholicism. And so he sort of said something like, "Well, maybe you should investigate it before you start, saying things about it." But yeah, so I just, in my conversations with him, he basically pointed me to the Church Fathers on newadvent.org and was like, "Well, you can read the writings yourself of the Christians, the letters of St. Ignatius from like the early 100s and St. Justin Martyr." And I never knew that. I didn't know that there were figures from this period. So I started reading it, and what I discovered was just that they were not talking about Protestantism in any meaningful sense, In a way, they were kind of describing Protestantism in the sense that you have to have that initial act of faith, right? That's clear but that's not the end. It's not as if you say, "I believe, whew, thank God, it's all done now. I can just sort of die." But rather, you believe so that you can be transformed more and more into the image of Christ. Like, that's the message of the Church Fathers, as I discovered while arguing with this atheist. So then I think I went to a mass. I forget when, but I went to one, and it didn't bother me, and I liked it. But I liked that I didn't have to kind of pretend. In a lot of the youth services I'd been to in like Protestant churches, you're supposed to kind of pretend to get into it, and then after 2 or 3 times when they know your name, they're like, "Hey, Gideon, how's your walk with the Lord now?" And you're like, "I don't know. I pray, but it's like they're expecting you to have some contemplative prayer or something, But so it was definitely interesting, and I really enjoyed kind of the what would you say, the social aspect of it, just in that people coming together to do a definite thing in a definite way as an act of worship. That really appealed to me, and I don't know, I was very happy going through the process and learning more, and it just seemed like the more I learned, the more doors opened up in my mind to these other areas, and kind of whole new worlds almost.
So at some point, did you finally join the church while you were in college there?
Yeah, so I did. After a few years, it took me a little while. This friend of mine and I argued. He actually ended up becoming Catholic himself a number of years later. But I think the change in my mind, and I've said this before to other people, but the change was like when I started defending Catholicism. You're at these parties and people are joking like, "These Catholics, they worship Mary," and I'm like, "Okay, I'm not Catholic, but they don't worship Mary, guys, because of this, 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 and this." And then I kind of think, well, wait a minute, now why am I not Catholic?
Right.
I believe that the church is what it says it is. The Reformation doesn't seem to make much sense to me. It does make sense I was thinking at the time in terms of like some of the practices, and there definitely were things that needed to be addressed. But really, forming your own church, look at the results, So I had all those thoughts, and then I just realized that maybe it was a failure of courage, to step forward and say, I believe and profess all that the Holy Roman Catholic Church teaches to be revealed by God. That takes a commitment, And so I did go through the process in the year 2000. So I was received into Catholic Church in the Jubilee year, and it was a wonderful experience with the Paulist Fathers who run the not the Catholic Center, but again the St. Austin's Parish there by UT.
Great. So while you were there in college, kind of a rough start. Yeah, the low engagement as a freshman, as they would say today.
That's true.
Retention risk maybe, but what finally did you end up majoring in?
That's a good question. So I was I was really engaged in learning, and I loved study, but I didn't like my classes. Not even the topics per se, but just like that mode. I just hadn't been disciplined enough to see it yet. Still in my mind, there was this dissonance between the stuff that they want me to learn, and the stuff that I want to learn. And they were getting closer and closer. I remember this one time I was walking through the PCL, which is like one of the largest libraries in the world, I think, on UT's campus. It was like 8 in the morning. It was a Saturday morning. It was raining. And I just happened to see the spine of this book the title was A Noise of War. So, well, that's a great title. So I pulled it off and started reading it. And it was about Caesar, Pompey, and Octavian at the end of the Roman Republic and the establishment of the Roman Empire. And that was just so fascinating to me. And I really got interested in it through also the study of Latin, which this friend of mine had taken up because he was a math major, and his idea was that mathematicians need to know Latin. So he was studying it, and I was kind of helping him a little bit. So I ended up, from those two directions, and this friend actually told me once, again, sort of offhand, he's like, well, a really educated man, if you really want to be educated, you have to know Greek and Latin. And again, I kind of received it in the way that I did many of the things when I was a child. I was like, well, okay. He gave me some historical evidence, just sort of simply, And this was the sort of fellow who had like read the Encyclopedia Britannica by the time he was 18 and remembered a lot of it, so he could just spontaneously kind of discourse on whatever he wanted, basically. But anyway, so those three things, I think, the engaging of the story, and then the actual looking through the language a little bit with him, and then his prompting that it's necessary, led me to major in Greek and Latin, which turned out at that time in the 90s, UT Austin was one of the premier classics departments in the world. We had like more than 50 faculty or something, and more than 150, I think, students studying ancient Greek and Latin. And I just walked in, I didn't know. And most of these other students were there because they'd been admitted and all this other stuff, and they came with Latin from high school or something. I wasn't that way. So that actually kind of made a change in my life too, because I realized pretty quickly, like on day 2, I realized that I actually have to study the Latin here. There's no way that I'm going to be able to do it without a disciplined study. So I just committed myself to get up every morning at 6:30 and do my studies no matter what. Even if I felt didn't have any more, I would study from 8 to 5 every single day. And if I had to do more, I would just do it, or just add on more. That's fine. But the minimum was going to be that. And that is really what turned my life around in a certain sense. I mean, not like it was bad before, but I didn't really have direction. I wasn't really excelling in my classes and whatnot. But partly, I think what helped too is I with that amount of disciplined work, you can do well. In Latin. And Latin is not like the goal is, at least in learning the language, there's not tons of sort of interpretive questions or things that are, sort of variable. It's basically just, it's like math. There's these answers, and you either know the answer or you don't, and that's the end, So I just found that if I just disciplined myself and just memorized everything in the textbook, then I'd be good. I could get an A that way. And so that's what I did, because I knew otherwise I would be I'd be in academic trouble. So, and that opened up so many doors, and it also connected a little bit with the study of the Church Fathers and whatnot.
So you wrap up at UT Austin. You're Catholic. You've got this degree in classics in Greek and Latin. What comes next for you?
It's a good question. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go. I'd always loved telling stories and loved writing and things like that. And I knew that I wanted to I knew that something was wrong with the world in some sense, and that even people who, were Christian, Catholic, whatever, I could just look out on the streets almost even and just see that people didn't really, this sounds sort of odd, but it didn't really know how to live, and not that I felt that I knew how to live, but I had some really close friendships, like very close friendships, and so I kind of had this sense that maybe my friends and I were able to offer a model to people. I mean, I wouldn't have ever stated this at the time, but just this feeling that I had something to give to the world in a sense. And so I thought that would be best offered in story form, telling stories of great friends and things like that. So I started doing some writing, worked on one book in particular, which I did end up finishing, but the first draft of the book was 1,000 pages, and the last draft was 242 pages. So it was a merciless, it took a lot of effort on my part. And I just never gave up on trying to make it as good as I could possibly make it. And it took me about 12 years to really get it to a point where I was happy enough with it, you know. And during that time, that was about from the end of my undergrad, which was 2001. For the next few years, I kind of was like just reading everything I could and working places like UPS and, you know, good jobs, but nothing like a career. And I lived in Idaho for a little while with this friend of mine. This atheist friend actually developed kind of a serious mental problem or something, and so his dad asked me to come there and live with him. So I did, and loved the country up there. It's so beautiful. But yeah, so I was reading, and the more I did those studies and reading and writing, the more it became clear to me that I just was not very good. I didn't know the tradition of literature. I couldn't, you know, I found it difficult to really understand some of these classical texts. Not classical meaning like Greek and Latin. I was better at those, but you know just kind of how to really tell a story that would be compelling to people and communicate meaning. And I was beginning to see and this would ultimately lead me to philosophy, but I was beginning to see that in order to write something, you have to know. And I didn't know that before. And that's kind of funny. I thought that I could just kind of like write my way into this beautiful world, you know, write my way into truth that I would then offer to people, but you can't communicate what you don't have. And so I was increasingly made aware of that just from my own studies. And so that's a big part of what kind of impelled me almost to go to graduate school first. And this was 2005 when I went to the Catholic University of America, but first for like more the literary side of things, to learn more languages, to learn more history, historical stuff, which had been my entree, you know. And so yeah, that's what led me to the Catholic University of America. And I was accepted to their Medieval and Byzantine Studies Center, not to anything which I would later become affiliated with, which was like philosophy and theology. And that's because I was starting out kind of on the literary side of things.
Any highlights or formative influences during your time at CUA, professors, classes?
Yeah, definitely. I think part of what suited me well, just at the general level and then specifically, was that I was able to take whatever kind of classes I wanted. I mean, in the Medieval Byzantine Studies Center, they have, or had, it's actually changed a little bit now, but they had a series of core classes that were primarily languages and things like that. You had and then some surveys of philosophy and theology, but then beyond that, you were pretty open as to what you could take. So I took everything from like Old French grammar to medieval canon law to, you know, philosophy, theology, some stuff in Augustine, you know, Greek stuff, all kinds of just fascinating, pretty much wherever I wanted to go. And we didn't have a lot of supervision. So, you know, typically you have kind of an advisor who's helping you along and saying like, well, you don't want to take that because I somehow slipped through the cracks or something. But that was actually good for me because it enabled me to really sort of explore on my own. I think an advisor would have coached me, and rightly so, would have said, look, you want to do literature, so you need to do this, this, and this, you know. And I ended up studying under Timothy Noon, who was a great philosopher there, focused on Duns Scotus primarily, but also St. Thomas and Augustine. Was really widely known for being able to spot sources. Like if you're reading a Latin manuscript where it's just no sources are given, and the author says something like, as someone says, da da da, and then Noon was able to know just like offhand where the citation is, who the author is, and where in this person's text. So we sort of joked that he's the magister foncium, you know, the master of the sources. So he was very good. And how I got kind of connected with him is he was put in charge of the Medieval Byzantine Studies Center for a while. And so I engaged with him first, not like as a scholar in a certain sense, in the narrow kind of historical sense, but as a philosopher. So I had, from this friend of mine who ended up becoming Catholic and had kind of a mental difficulty, but had degrees in philosophy and physics and whatnot. I'd always been interested in analytic philosophy and their kind of focus on actually coming to the truth and discovering things rather than just saying what Kant thought or, you know, Hegel's views or whatever. And so I actually had, you know, substantial philosophical questions that I was interested in. And by this point I would come to be aware of things like Fides et Ratio and the Second Vatican Council, both of which call for Catholic theologians to kind of make a universal framework of the disciplines and organize everything together. So that's what I started talking to Noon about, Timothy Noon. And I remember this one conversation we had. He was coming out of the president's office or the whatever director's office. And he was carrying like 2 laptops and this bag of books and had his coat draped over his shoulder. And so I strike up with this conversation about a universal framework of knowledge. And he and I stood there for 3 hours in exactly those positions. And he was like shifting the stuff around as because he clearly wanted to leave, but yet he was such a great mind that he could, just on the spot be able to discourse meaningfully. And he really, I think, loved doing that and didn't like kind of cutting people off for administrative, I have to go kind of reasons. So that was really formative for me, and got me interested in, let's put it this way, made me aware that behind my desires for kind of literary work was a necessity to have the philosophical and theological understanding, and once I saw that, okay, I actually need to know before I can write, I therefore need to know the philosophy and theology, and that kind of shifted my emphasis into that realm.
So you end up working with Timothy Noon, but your dissertation, correct me if I'm wrong, is Augustine and in particular his work De Doctrina Christiana,
That's right.
On Christian teaching.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that work. What is it? What does Augustine have to say in that?
Sure. Yeah, so Augustine's goal in De Doctrina Christiana comes from a certain set of circumstances in North Africa in the 390s. So Augustine is made a priest in the early 390s, and then he is made a bishop in 396. And at that time, it's actually historically very interesting compared to our time. So at that time, historians estimate that 90% of Christians in North Africa were Donatist heretics, and that Catholics were only like a 10% minority. And Augustine undertook to re-evangelize, essentially. And by the time of his death, the numbers were reversed. He had been able to basically transform North Africa back into a fully Catholic church in 35 years. And this book, De Doctrina Christiana, there's no like direct place where he says this, but it's clearly meant for the purpose of teaching priests how to preach, and how to kind of like interpret the scriptures for their audiences, which typically had not been done before. Under normal circumstances in the 390s, most priests did not preach. That was reserved to the bishop. Augustine was one of the first priests that would actually do some preaching. And so part of his effort was to extend this capacity to preach throughout the priesthood. Not that it was just universally given to everybody, even in North Africa, but nevertheless, he wanted to kind of push that. But in order to do that, you actually have to have an education. I mean, again, you have to know before you can speak. So the goal of the book is to bring together all the different disciplines and understandings of antiquity, or kind of like knowledge from antiquity, for the sake of interpreting the Bible. And his first goal is to enable the student to have learned kind of the essential philosophical, theological truths at that higher level about what love is and God and whatnot, so that all of your interpretations can be formed by those. And he sets out to undertake this. And then in later books, he talks about, well, how does mathematics relate to Scripture? All these other things. So you can see the connection between, and Timothy Noon is the one who kind of directed me into this, the connection between Augustine's early attempt to integrate all the different disciplines into a kind of a universal practical framework, and then later the kinds of questions that I got interested in, and see connected with the Second Vatican Council and Fides et Ratio. But so Augustine's trying to give students, or I should say priests, the capacity to preach, by first talking about how the different ambiguities in Scripture can be resolved, and then secondly, in the fourth book, talking about how kind of giving you advice about how to study oratory, essentially. So that's the main goal there, and I think the testament of it is twofold. The testament of its value really is just that through this kind of program, he was able to partly, and he did a bunch of other stuff was able to re-evangelize North Africa. And then this book also provides kind of like the framework on which Peter the Lombard bases his sentences commentary. This is where the signs and things that are in the Lombard's books of the sentences kind of come from. And so it therefore provides sort of a frame in key distinctions for the whole of the Western medieval tradition.
Yeah. Wow. So you complete your work there at CUA on Augustine. How does your teaching career begin, and where do you end up?
I started teaching at CUA, just got, various appointments of different kinds, teaching assistant, things like that. I ended up getting a job at the local college out in Maryland called Montgomery College, doing Latin. And Latin and Greek teaching have since then been kind of like the bread and butter of what I do. I think because, I have a strong foundation in that, and it's always something that always a need for, and I actually like it because then it gives me something, it sort of keeps me firmly rooted in the languages. I think one struggle for someone who advances in these different disciplines is that, the further you get away from your graduate training in Greek, the more difficult it is to kind of get back into it. And so that's not been something I've had to struggle with just for these reasons. So I did a lot of those. Ended up teaching for the Dominicans a little while at the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception, and Greek and Latin for them. And then after that, after I finished my dissertation and defended it in 2014, at the end of that hiring cycle, there was a position that came open at the Legionaries of Christ, their College of Humanities in Cheshire, which I applied for. It was primarily to do Greek and Latin. And I had other, as you can see from this, kind of interests, but it seemed to me that I would be able to do this, really well. And I also liked that it would keep me sort of grounded in it. And they have been more than supportive of all my other efforts. And so that's primarily how I kind of got into my current position.
So tell us about the College of Humanities. I think probably it's not an institution with which most people are familiar. So what's it like? What's the day-to-day there like?
Sure.
Who are your students?
My students are Legionary of Christ seminarians who have completed their 2-year novitiate, and then they're studying Greek and Latin with us for 2 years, and other subjects too. And then that's kind of the prologue and preparation for their philosophy studies in Rome. So they do basically a 5-year degree program, 2 years that are focused on kind of an intensive Latin and Greek with literature and art history and things like that. So think of it as kind of core humanistic approach, with also some sciences and what I actually teach, the mathematics course and the physics course. And some other, all kind of with a philosophical edge. And frequently the courses are preparation for philosophy in the sense that they're kind of half philosophical, which we found at least is particularly useful for young men of our time, because they're not ready to read Plato right away. They're not, they're not ready to just dive right into Aristotle's physics. They don't really understand it as easily. And of course we get, kids from, or not kids, but young men from all walks of life. Some of them very devout families, some from the streets of Miami, practically. So it's a good preparation for them. The courses are administered in the more or less standard way. I'm trying to think if there's anything that we do sort of pedagogically that's that different. I would say one element is we have a number of faculty who are trained in spoken Greek and Latin from the Vivarium Institute in Italy. And so they bring to the brothers this kind of like Latin and Greek as living languages. And so that has proved very productive for a number of the brothers. Not for everybody all the time, but that I think has been a real positive of ours. But the main way to understand what we're doing is kind of preparing the students for these higher studies in philosophy. And then after that, those students usually do a 2-year internship somewhere, and then they come back to their school in Rome for 3 years of theology, and then they become deacons, and then they're
usually ordained.
professed.
Yeah, fully professed or ordained. Yeah. Any particular joys of teaching or difficulties of teaching seminarians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say the thing I like most about it, teaching seminarians in this institution, is that they're eager for what they understand. That if they don't understand something, then it's hard for them to kind of get excited about it. excuse me, that makes sense. But on the other hand, you can help them to see the value of something. And when you do, they can actually undergo fairly significant changes. Young men who, I remember this one who was told when he was younger that, you're just not, you don't really have it intellectually, you're not really that gifted, you're more going to be doing practical stuff and whatnot. And I mean, he and I worked together and just totally were able to transform that. Not that he didn't come in wanting to transform it. He came in by telling me, look, Dr. Kearns, I'm like a practical guy. I like sports and, I'm not really, I can't do all this intellectual stuff, And so part of what I do is kind of like one-on-one with them a little bit. I kind of say, well, all right, brother, fair enough. Sometimes that's how we are, but like, where'd you get that idea? Is that just something is that your experience? He's like, well, actually, this principal of the school told me that. I was like, oh, it's kind of weird. Why would he tell you that? So, and I think the thing, like in terms of like, the most general thing I like the most about it is I have a good degree of freedom to help the students in their first semester really to kind of get into the studies more so. I think a lot of people, even when you go to college, even if you want the degree, you still kind of think like, okay, the teachers are over there. I'm here. Like, what am I supposed to do? And then, okay, I did that, so boom, I'm done. And my goal is to kind of turn that inside out, to put the student at the heart of his education, and to reveal to him that this is a love. This is your greatest love. You don't know it yet, but this is your greatest love, and it's going to transform everything in your life. And when you're 40, you're not going to be playing soccer, maybe once every few months, but you're going to be doing this, and this is higher and better and more perfective of you as a man. And, if you just tell somebody that straight up, especially, like guys on the street or something, they're going to be like, okay, man, that's cool. Yeah. They're not going to, at least it's harder for them to understand it. So what I try to do is sort of pull that out of them. And partly I do that by, as I was mentioning to you earlier, kind of helping them to see that a lot of their experiences in school may not be reflective of what the intellectual life really is like. It's not meant to just be this terrible slog where you don't understand things. You're meant to ask why, and you're meant to get the answers. And once you get them kind of, once they get the taste of why, it's hard to stop them sometimes.
So you made reference to this sort of almost ever-present intellectual interest of yours, which is, you describe as kind of a universal framework of knowledge or the sciences. Mm-hmm. Tell us, in as brief a compass as it will allow,
sure,
what is this project of trying to kind of organize human learning?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So if you think about something like, just to put kind of to problematize things a little bit, as people say, we have accounts from, say, Aristotle and Plato and St. Thomas of the human person, of the human faculties, of human habits and things like that. And that's received tradition, and you can work through that with a competent philosopher, theologian of the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. But then when you switch over to cultural and social anthropology, and its deliverances about they usually don't use the word habits, but human lifeways and social forms and discourse and all this other stuff, you're confronted with two things, and it's not clear exactly how to bring them together. And particularly social and cultural anthropology will stress, for example, cultural relativism of all values. Obviously, that's something that is not consonant with the Catholic intellectual tradition, and in fact can be demonstrably refuted. Although I would say most anthropologists don't really know that. But the point is, like, how do you bring these things? How do you bring them together into an ordered whole? And MacIntyre, at the end of God, Philosophy, Universities, calls the Catholic intellectual tradition, kind of reasserts the call that was given, well, not first, but in a defining way in Aeterni Patris by Pope Leo XIII, and then at Gaudium et Spes of the Second Vatican Council, and then in Fides et Ratio of John Paul II, and MacIntyre is sort of asking in a somewhat frustrated way at the end of the book, like, we really need to do this. And everyone is content to, well, I wouldn't say that, but I think he just feels that it's an urgent problem for people in these other disciplines. Philosophers, theologians can look at it and say, well, obviously quantum physics doesn't refute Aristotle's definition of change. That's clear to us, but it's not clear to physicists. And so the question is, well, how do we bring those together? And so what I would argue is the principal difficulties are actually in this kind of work, are helping faculty and other disciplines to understand what you're really saying from the philosophical and theological view. A lot of times people have thought in the past that this kind of philosophical framework or system would just be so recondite and so difficult that no one could actually do it. What I found that it's actually straightforward and fairly simple to kind of see it all laid out. And so I've done this in a number of my papers published in Logos and some other places. And the point is just that we're laying out what the basic outlines are, and you're not trying to resolve every conceivable objection or difficulty.
Between science.
Exactly, right. So you're saying, what is the essence here? So I'll just give you an example. With one of my first papers was on history. What is history? Well, we use the term history in a number of senses, but just to kind of cut to the chase of it to a degree, we can always tell the history of some particular type of thing, like the history of this government, or the history of stars, or the history of, the evolution of lions, or something like that. You can always tell a history of something, or the history of a language, So in every discipline, there's always a component of it that is kind of the telling of the history of that discipline and of those objects. But then typically we use the term history to refer to things related to human communities and to human history. And so what discipline does that primarily kind of like help us do better at? And the answer to that is moral philosophy in the general sense. Politics, political philosophy, moral philosophy. And the reason is just because you need the experience of other people. You need the experience of reading the histories of Rome and the early colonies and things like that in order to be able to make judgments in political philosophy. I mean, that's obvious. Or even in the case of your own experience of the virtues, you have to have experience from your own life, or reading the memoirs of great men, or memoirs of ordinary people, or literature, or whatever, to kind of form the experience to make those kinds of judgments. So if you think about a 10-year-old or 12-year-old trying to read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he just doesn't have enough experience, So this reveals, just in a brief way, that history as a discipline kind of fits in one way within every discipline, but then in its primary human way, it's sort of subordinate to and a part of moral philosophy. And it's most of what I've discovered is that the disciplines kind of fit together in ways that are fairly straightforward to see. So that's been very rewarding, and I'm happy to report a lot of progress on that.
Okay, good. You sort of started, and we'll close with this, but you sort of started with this interest, your intellectual interest, with a desire to write, to kind of convey something meaningful. But then sort of realized that you didn't have much to say because you didn't know as much as you needed to know. Obviously, since that time to now, you've learned a lot. You have this, you have the facility with the languages to be an educated person, and you also have this sort of outlook on all of human learning. And so, is there any desire to return to a literary pursuit? Is there a novel in the works behind the scenes? Do you have any?
Yeah, it's a good question. I certainly have the desire to do it to a certain degree. It's an enjoyable occupation for sure. I think at this point my focus still remains on kind of in a certain sense, and for those who love literature, perhaps this will be kind of something interesting to them. Maybe that I've found myself drawn more and more to the higher things, to the work of philosophy and theology. And although I love literature and will always love it, I think my desire to communicate the truth finds its kind of end or terminus better, more perfectly maybe in teaching philosophy, theology, writing about that. And it's certainly true though that I've always maintained. I still continue to write, some stuff. I'm kind of philosophically opposed to novels, actually, but that's just a whole other question. But I think there's a lot to say, and I suppose I still find myself learning enough, to kind of be, what would be the word? To still be sort of waiting. I do suppose though that I have ideas for writing something that would provide more like a vision of the universe, but instead of in an academic key, rather in terms of something like a story, of sort of a tour almost. But we'll see what that comes to one day.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your submission to the encyclopedia and for being here today. It's been a joy to have you.
Oh, thank you.